The first-class cabin was a bubble of quiet, a soft hum of engineered air and distant engine noise that promised escape. It was a world painted in muted grays and creams, with the warm glow of individual reading lights creating small, private islands in the dimness. The air itself felt different here, cleaner, scented with a faint hint of expensive leather and the fresh coffee a flight attendant had just poured for a passenger. A few rows up. In this carefully curated space, the chaos of the airport, the stress of security lines, and the rush of modern life seemed to melt away, replaced by a profound and peaceful stillness. Tucked into a window seat near the rear of this exclusive section was a man who seemed to be a part of that stillness. He was dressed in clothes that had seen better days, a pair of dark, worn-out jeans, a simple, long-sleeved t-shirt in a faded black, and scuffed leather boots that looked like they had walked many miles. His dark hair was unruly, falling across his forehead in a way that suggested he'd run his hands through it countless times. He wasn't reading or working on a laptop. Instead, he was just looking out the window, his forehead resting lightly against the cool plastic of the pane, watching the ground crew scurry like ants on the tarmac below. There was a deep weariness about him, not just in the slight slump of his shoulders, but in his entire presence. It was the kind of tired that went beyond a lack of sleep, a quiet heaviness that seemed to radiate from him. To the few other passengers who glanced his way, he was just another traveler. Perhaps an artist or a writer, someone who didn't belong to the world of sharp suits and gleaming briefcases. He was, for the moment, completely anonymous, and that was exactly what he wanted. He was a man seeking refuge, not in luxury, but in the simple, profound gift of being left alone. This fragile peace was shattered, not by a sound, but by a presence. The curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane was pulled aside with a sharp, almost aggressive swish, and a man strode through as if he owned the very air he was breathing. He was a loud splash of color and noise in the hushed cabin. His suit was a bold pinstripe, the fabric so sharp it looked like it could cut, and it was perfectly tailored to his frame. His shoes, polished to a high gloss, reflected the cabin's low lighting as he walked. A Bluetooth headset glowed with a steady blue light in his ear, and he was speaking into it, his voice booming and confident. Completely ignoring the quiet atmosphere he had just invaded. No, listen to me, he barked, his voice carrying easily to every seat in the section. The market doesn't care about your feelings. It cares about disruption. We need to be the tiger, not the gazelle. Are you a tiger or a gazelle, David? He paused, listening for a moment, a smug grin on his face. That's what I thought, tiger. Get it done, he ended the call with a sharp tap on his earpiece and tossed the expensive-looking leather briefcase onto the seat, directly across the aisle from the quiet man by the window. The bag landed with a heavy thud, making the seat cushions shudder. He then shrugged off his suit jacket, folding it with a practiced, almost theatrical flourish before draping it over the back of his chair. Every movement was designed to be noticed. A performance of power and success. He surveyed the cabin like a king surveying his kingdom. His eyes, sharp and critical, swept over the other passengers, dismissing them one by one. An elderly woman reading a book? Irrelevant. A couple whispering to each other? Insignificant. His gaze continued its path until it landed on the man in the worn jeans, who was still staring out the window, seemingly oblivious to the new arrival. The man in the suit's expression changed. A flicker of something disdain, maybe even disgust, crossed his features before being replaced by a look of predatory interest. To him, this man was an imperfection. He was a blemish on the pristine canvas of first class. In a world that, in his mind, should be populated exclusively by winners, by fellow tigers, this quiet, simply dressed individual was an anomaly. He didn't fit the script. He wasn't projecting success, and for the man in the suit, that was the greatest sin of all. He could feel a familiar itch. A need to assert his dominance, to remind everyone, and perhaps himself, exactly where he stood on the ladder of life. He saw a man who looked like he didn't have a care in the world, and it infuriated him. He saw a man who wasn't playing the game, and he felt a compulsive need to force him onto the board. The quiet man by the window represented everything the man in the suit had fought against his entire life. Complacency, anonymity, a lack of ambition. He wasn't just a person, he was a symbol. And the man in the suit decided, in that instant, that this symbol needed to be broken, publicly, so that everyone in this small, enclosed space could be reminded of the natural order of things. He leaned back in his plush leather seat, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. The sanctuary was no longer quiet. The hunt was about to begin. The man in the suit let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, a sound designed to draw attention. He clicked his fingers, a sharp, insolent sound that cut through the cabin's quiet hum, and a flight attendant hurried over, her professional smile firmly in place. He didn't look at her, instead keeping his eyes fixed on the quiet man by the window, as if his next words were meant for him alone. "Whiskey," he said, his voice firm and commanding. "The good stuff, not the cheap one." He finally turned to the attendant, a dismissive look on his face. "And bring the whole bottle. I have a feeling it's going to be a long flight." As the attendant scurried away, he leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head and stretching his legs out into the aisle, a clear sign of ownership. He was staking his claim not just on the empty space, but on the entire atmosphere of the cabin. The flight attendant returned quickly, placing a crystal glass and a bottle of expensive-looking whiskey on his tray table with a steady hand. He poured himself a generous amount, the amber liquid splashing against the sides of the glass. He took a slow sip, savoring it, his eyes never leaving the back of the quiet man's head. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. The other passengers could feel it, a palpable tension that made the air feel heavy. A woman a few rows ahead pretended to be deeply engrossed in the in-flight magazine, but she hadn't turned a page in minutes. "Hard day at the office?" The man in the suit finally said, his voice laced with a heavy, syrupy sarcasm that was impossible to miss. He said it just loud enough to carry over the low drone of the engines. A verbal dart aimed directly at the man in the worn jeans. The quiet man by the window slowly turned his head. His movement was unhurried, calm. His eyes, which had been gazing at the world outside with a distant sadness, now met the man in the suit's gaze. There was no anger there, no defensiveness, just a deep, quiet stillness. He held the look for a moment, gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug, and then turned his head back to the window. The dismissal was total. It was as if he had acknowledged a fly buzzing around his head and then decided it wasn't worth swatting. This lack of a reaction was not what the man in the suit had expected. It was like throwing a punch at a ghost and having your hand go right through it. He felt a hot flush of irritation creep up his neck. He was used to getting a response. People were supposed to be intimidated by him, or impressed, or at the very least, annoyed. They were supposed to react? They were supposed to play their part in the little drama he was directing. This man's refusal to engage was a challenge, a silent act of rebellion that he could not tolerate. He took another, larger gulp of his whiskey, the ice cubes clinking angrily against the glass. He decided to try a different approach, a more direct one. "Or maybe no office at all?" he said, his voice a little louder this time, a little more pointed. "Some people just don't have the drive to succeed, I guess. They'd rather just exist." He said the word exist as if it were something foul he had just tasted. He looked around the cabin, a smirk playing on his lips, trying to pull the other passengers into his cruel game. You see them everywhere. Just floating through life, no ambition, no goals, just taking up space. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An older man in the row across cleared his throat loudly, a subtle signal of disapproval. But the man in the suit was beyond caring about subtle signals. He was on a roll now, his frustration fueling his performance. He was no longer just trying to provoke the quiet man. He was trying to prove something to the entire cabin. He was the winner, the successful one, the tiger. And this man by the window was his Exhibit A, the perfect example of a gazelle. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial stage whisper that was somehow even louder than his normal speaking voice. "You know, the world is a simple place. It's divided into two types of people. The ones who build things, who make things happen, who leave a mark. And the ones who just watch. The passengers, not the pilots. He gestured with his whiskey glass towards the quiet man, a sloppy, arrogant movement. And you can always tell them just by looking. It's in the eyes. It's in the way they hold themselves. They have this air of quiet defeat. The quiet man had not moved a muscle. He continued to stare out the window, his profile a mask of unreadable calm. It was as if the man in the suit was shouting into a void. This utter lack of response was maddening. The bully was becoming desperate, his performance growing more frantic and more ugly. He needed a reaction, any reaction, to validate himself. He stood up, pacing in the small space in front of his seat, his expensive suit rustling with every agitated movement. "I mean, look at him," he said, now addressing the cabin directly. "What has he ever accomplished? What has he ever contributed? He's probably never taken a risk in his life. Never stayed up all night to close a deal. Never bet everything on an idea and won. He just, sits there. A perfect picture of mediocrity." He stopped pacing and stood over the quiet man's seat, looming over him, a physical manifestation of his verbal aggression. The entire first-class cabin was now silent, the only sound the hum of the engines and the man's ragged, angry breathing. Every eye was on the scene, a mixture of fear, anger, and morbid curiosity on the faces of the onlookers. The man in the suit had his audience. He had made his scene. He leaned down, his face close to the quiet man's ear, his voice a venomous hiss that everyone could still hear. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just finally realizing what a sad little life you lead?" The words hung in the air, ugly and sharp. It was one of those moments where time seems to stretch and thin, the silence becoming a physical presence in the cabin. The man in the suit remained standing, his chest puffed out, a triumphant smirk on his face. He was a predator who had just cornered his prey, and he was waiting for the final, satisfying whimper. He expected tears, or a shouted curse, or a pathetic attempt to defend a life he had just torn to shreds. He was waiting for the victory, but the victory never came. The quiet man by the window didn't flinch. He didn't turn around with fire in his eyes. He didn't shrink away in shame. He just sat there, his back still to the bully, his posture unchanged. The lack of any reaction was more powerful than any retaliation could have ever been. It was a wall of pure, unbreakable indifference. It was as if the bully's words, which he had crafted with such cruel precision, were just meaningless noise, like the hum of the engines or the rustle of a newspaper. They had no impact. They had no power. Slowly, deliberately, the quiet man reached down to the seat pocket beside him. He pulled out the worn paperback he had been reading earlier. For a moment, he just held it in his hands, his thumb tracing the creased spine. Then, with a gentle, almost reverent motion, he closed the book. It wasn't an angry snap. It was a soft, final thud that seemed to echo in the suffocating silence. He then leaned forward and slid the book into a simple, canvas backpack that was tucked under the seat in front of him. He zipped it up with a quiet, deliberate pull. Every single person in the first-class cabin was watching him. They weren't watching the bully anymore. All eyes were on this quiet man, on the simple, graceful way he was preparing to leave the conversation that had never really started. He wasn't running away. He was simply deciding that this was no longer worth his time. It was an act of such profound dignity that it made the bully's performance seem even more cheap and tawdry. The man in the suit's smirk began to falter, replaced by a flicker of confusion. This wasn't in the script. The victim was supposed to fight back or curl up. He wasn't supposed to pack his bags and mentally check out. As the quiet man settled back in his seat, his hands now resting calmly in his lap, he finally turned his head. But he didn't look at the man in the suit. His gaze swept past him, past the other passengers, and settled on the window once more. But this time his expression was different. The deep, thoughtful weariness was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. It was a look of profound sadness, a kind of quiet pity. It was the look you might give a child throwing a tantrum, not with anger, but with a weary disappointment that they couldn't be better. He looked at the bully's reflection in the window, a distorted, angry shape in the dark glass, and for the first time a hint of emotion crossed his face. It wasn't for himself. It was for the bully. It was a look that said, "Is this really all you have? Is this all you are?" That look was the final straw for one of the other passengers. An older gentleman who had been pretending to read a newspaper finally lowered it. His face was a mask of quiet fury. "That's enough," he said, his voice steady and firm, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Leave the young man alone. He hasn't done a thing to you." The man in the suit, startled by this interruption from a new direction, spun around. He glared at the older man, his arrogance quickly returning to cover his confusion. "This doesn't concern you, old-timer," he sneered. "Why don't you go back to your crossword puzzle and let the adults talk?" "I am an adult," the older man replied, his voice unwavering. "And adults don't behave like schoolyard bullies. You're making a fool of yourself." The bully's face turned a shade of red. He was being challenged from two fronts now, and his control over the situation was slipping. He opened his mouth to deliver another insult, but he never got the chance. A figure appeared at his side, moving with a quiet efficiency that commanded respect. It was one of the flight attendants, a woman with kind eyes but a very firm set to her jaw. She had been watching the entire exchange from the galley, waiting for the right moment to step in. "Sir," she said, her voice polite but with an edge of steel that was impossible to ignore, "I'm going to have to ask you to take your seat." The man in the suit looked at her as if she were an insect. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Or what? You'll throw me off the plane? I paid good money for this seat. I'll do whatever I want." He gestured dismissively towards the quiet man. "This guy's a nobody. I'm just having a little fun." The flight attendant's expression hardened. Her eyes, which had been patient, now turned cold. She took a small step closer, lowering her voice so only he and the surrounding passengers could hear. "Sir, you have been harassing this passenger since you boarded. You have been disruptive, loud, and abusive. This is your final warning. You will sit down, you will be quiet, and you will not speak to or bother anyone else for the remainder of this flight. If you fail to comply, we will divert this plane to the nearest airport, and you will be met by federal law enforcement. Do you understand me?" The threat was real, and it landed with the force of a physical blow. The man in the suit's face went from red to a pale, clammy white. He looked around the cabin and saw that he had no allies. Every single passenger was looking at him with a mixture of contempt and relief. The older man gave him a slow, deliberate shake of his head. He was completely, utterly isolated. His performance was over, and he had been revealed not as a powerful tiger, but as a loud, pathetic man with a fragile ego and a cruel streak. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the flight attendant, then at the quiet man, who was still looking out the window, seemingly oblivious to the drama that had just reached its climax. Defeated, the man in the suit slunk back into his seat. He sank down into the plush leather, trying to make himself as small as possible. The king was dead, and his kingdom had crumbled in less than a minute. The flight attendant held his gaze for a moment longer, ensuring her message had been received, before turning her attention to the quiet man by the window. Her entire demeanor changed in an instant. The steel in her eyes melted away, replaced by a look of deep, genuine respect and compassion. She leaned down and spoke to him in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper. The flight attendant leaned down, her voice a soft murmur meant only for the man by the window. "Sir," she began, her tone now filled with a warmth that had been absent just moments before, "I am so sorry for that disturbance. Is there anything at all I can get for you? A blanket? A different tea? Anything at all?" The quiet man looked up at her, and for the first time a faint, tired smile touched his lips. It was a small gesture, but it transformed his face, lighting it up with a genuine warmth that seemed to push back the shadows of weariness. "I'm okay," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Thank you, really, you didn't have to do that." The flight attendant shook her head, her own smile firm and resolute. "Yes, I did. We all did." She straightened up, but before she could move away, Her eyes fell upon the man in the suit, who was slumped in his seat, staring at his tray table as if it were the most interesting thing he had ever seen. A look of cold resolve settled on her face. She decided that a simple apology wasn't enough. The man in the suit needed to understand the depth of his mistake. He needed to know who he had tried to break. She turned her body slightly, projecting her voice just enough so that the surrounding rows could hear every word. It wasn't a shout. It was a calm, clear, and devastatingly public statement. "You know," she said, her voice carrying a new authority, "it's funny how people judge others. They see a quiet man in simple clothes and they assume he's a nobody. They see a man who isn't shouting about his success and they think he has none." She paused, letting her eyes sweep over the now silent cabin. Every passenger was listening, captivated by the sudden shift in power. "That man you were harassing," she continued, her gaze landing pointedly on the man in the suit, "just spent the last 6 months working 14-hour days. 6 days a week, filming a physically demanding movie. He performed his own stunts, trained for months, and put his body through hell to entertain people." The man in the suit flinched, but didn't look up. His knuckles were white where he gripped the armrests. "And what did he do with the multi-million-dollar salary he earned from all that hard work?" The flight attendant asked, her voice dripping with a quiet, controlled fury. "He didn't buy a new suit. He didn't brag about it on a phone call. He donated every single cent. He split it between a children's hospital and a foundation funding leukemia research." She let that sink in for a moment. The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow to the bully's pride. A soft gasp came from the passenger across the aisle. She wasn't finished. Her voice softened slightly, taking on a more personal, more heartbreaking tone. "And the reason he's on this plane today? The reason he's so tired and just wants to be left alone? He's flying to see his sister. She's been battling that same disease, leukemia, for over a decade. He spends as much time with her as he possibly can between projects. This flight isn't a vacation for him. It's part of his life." The cabin was utterly, completely silent. The hum of the engine seemed to fade away into nothingness. The truth was out, and it was more powerful than any insult the man in the suit could have ever devised. It wasn't just that he had bullied a famous actor. He had bullied a man who was, by all accounts, a genuinely good and selfless person. A man who was dealing with a private family pain. The bully's attempt to paint him as a failure, as a nobody, had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable, revealing him to be the only small, pathetic person in the cabin. The man in the suit felt a wave of heat wash over him, followed by a bone-deep chill. He could feel the eyes of every single passenger on him, but this time there was no fear, no discomfort. There was only pure, unadulterated contempt. He had wanted an audience, and now he had one. He was the star of the show, but he was the clown, the villain, the fool. His expensive suit felt like a costume, his polished shoes like clown shoes. The whiskey on his breath now smelled sour and cheap. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He shrunk down in his seat, wishing he could become invisible, wishing he could rewind the last hour and just sit down and be quiet. The atmosphere in the cabin had undergone a complete transformation. The tension was gone, replaced by a shared sense of respect and empathy for the quiet man. The older gentleman who had spoken up earlier caught the flight attendant's eye and gave her a slow, appreciative nod. A woman a few rows ahead discreetly wiped a tear from her eye. The world had been turned upside down, and the man they had barely noticed was now the center of their quiet admiration. The quiet man, for his part, seemed uncomfortable with the attention. He simply gave the flight attendant another small, grateful nod. He didn't look around for validation. He didn't acknowledge the other passengers. He just accepted her apology with a quiet grace and then turned his gaze back to the window, as if hoping to find his anonymity again in the clouds outside. But it was too late for that. He was no longer an anonymous traveler in worn-out jeans. He was a story, a lesson in humility and character that everyone on that plane would remember for a very long time. The flight attendant gave him one last, reassuring smile before moving back to the galley, leaving the man in the suit to drown in the silent, judgmental sea he had created for himself. The plane began its gentle descent, and the end of the flight was now a welcome relief for everyone, except for one man who had to face the long walk of shame. The captain's voice crackled through the cabin, calm and professional, announcing the beginning of their descent. For most, it was a welcome sound, the signal that the journey was almost over. But for the man in the suit, it was the tolling of a bell. Each word the captain spoke felt like a nail being hammered into the coffin of his dignity. The dull thud of the landing gear extending into the belly of the plane was the sound of a prison door locking shut. He was trapped, not just in his seat, but in the crushing weight of the silence he had created. The air, once a tool for his performance, now felt thick and heavy, pressing in on him, suffocating him with the unspoken judgment of everyone around. He kept his eyes fixed on the back of the seat in front of him, a beige landscape of utter boredom that he now found fascinating. He couldn't bring himself to look at the man by the window. To see that quiet profile, that picture of dignified strength, would be to see his own reflection as a fool. He could still hear the flight attendant's words echoing in his head, not as they were spoken, but as he now understood them. * Children's Hospital. Leukemia research. His sister. * Each phrase was a fresh wave of acid, burning away the last vestiges of his arrogance. He had built his entire identity on being a winner, a tiger, a man who mattered. And in one afternoon he had been revealed as a small, noisy, and utterly insignificant man who tormented a good person for sport. The expensive suit he wore felt like a lie, a costume he had put on to play a part he had utterly failed at. Across the aisle, the quiet man simply watched the world grow larger beneath them. The city lights began to bloom across the dark canvas of the ground, a sprawling, beautiful constellation. There was no sense of triumph in his posture, no smug satisfaction. He was just a man finishing a journey, his thoughts already miles ahead on the reason for his trip. The drama of the flight was a closed chapter for him, a brief, unpleasant storm he had weathered with quiet grace. He was thinking about his sister's smile, about the stories they would share, about the simple, precious moments of being together. The loud, desperate man in the suit was already fading from his mind, a minor inconvenience in a much larger, more important life. The plane touched down with a gentle bump and a roar of reverse thrust. The ride along the tarmac was smooth, but for the man in the suit, it was a rough, jarring journey to his own execution. He felt every jolt, every shudder of the wheels on the concrete. The seatbelt sign pinged off, its cheerful chime a mocking sound in the tense silence. The cabin came alive with the rustle of clothing, the clicking of seatbelts, and the soft beeps of phones being turned on. People began to gather their things, a normal, everyday activity that now felt like a slow, deliberate procession to his judgment day. The quiet man took his time. He waited until the aisle was relatively clear before unbuckling his own belt. He reached into the seat pocket in front of him and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He looked at it for a moment, a faint, sad smile on his face, before carefully tucking it into his wallet. Then he stood up, pulling his simple canvas backpack from under the seat. He slung it over one shoulder, a light, easy motion. As he turned to leave his row, an elderly woman who had been watching him with tear-filled eyes reached out and gently squeezed his arm. She didn't say a word, but her eyes spoke volumes, conveying a depth of respect and sympathy that needed no language. He gave her hand a soft pat in return, a small, acknowledging gesture of thanks. The flight attendant who had defended him was waiting by the exit of the row. As he passed, she spoke to him in a voice that was meant for no one else. "I hope your sister feels better soon," she said, her warmth a stark contrast to the coldness she had shown the bully. He stopped and looked at her, his eyes filled with a genuine gratitude that was humbling to witness. "Thank you," he said softly. "That means a lot." And then he was gone, moving down the aisle towards the front of the plane. Now it was the man in the suit's turn. His legs felt like lead as he forced himself to stand. He grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, its solid weight feeling flimsy and pathetic in his hand. He stepped into the aisle and began the longest walk of his life. It was a walk down a gauntlet of silent, burning eyes. No one shouted at him. No one said a word. That would have been a mercy. Instead, they treated him like he was invisible. A businessman deliberately turned his back to him to fiddle with his overhead bag. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, shielding her from his sight as if he were a disease. People looked through him, past him, anywhere but at him. The silence was a physical force, a wall of pure contempt that pushed against him with every step he took. He could feel their collective judgment, 1,000 unspoken condemnations that were louder than any scream. He reached the flight attendant at the door. She wouldn't even meet his gaze. She just gave a flat, professional, "Bye," her voice devoid of any emotion, and turned to the next passenger. He was nothing to her. He was nothing to any of them. He stumbled out into the bright, harsh lights of the airport terminal, a ghost expelled from a world where he no longer belonged. He didn't know where to go, so he just followed the crowd towards baggage claim, his head down, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He needed to disappear, to sink into the floor and be forgotten. He found a secluded spot near a concrete pillar and leaned against it, the cold surface a small comfort against his back, and then he saw him. The quiet man was standing by the carousel, patiently waiting for his bag, his simple backpack at his feet. He was just a part of the crowd, another tired traveler at the end of a long day. But then a young family nearby recognized him. The father's eyes went wide, and he gently nudged his wife, who pointed with a discreet gasp. Their little boy, no older than 7, stared with open-mouthed wonder. The man in the suit watched, expecting the quiet man to be annoyed, to put his head down and hurry away. But he didn't. He saw the family looking, and a gentle smile appeared on his face. The father, encouraged by the smile, hesitantly approached him. The quiet man greeted him with a warm nod. He then knelt down so he was at eye level with the little boy. He spoke to him softly, asking his name, and listened intently to the boy's excited, whispered questions. He took a picture with the family, his arm draped kindly around the boy's shoulders. He wasn't a movie star performing for a fan. He was just a kind man being kind to a child, from his hiding spot by the pillar. The man in the suit watched the entire interaction. And in that moment he finally understood. He saw it all so clearly. The quiet man's wealth wasn't in a bank account. It was in the genuine joy he could bring to a stranger. His power wasn't in a loud voice or an expensive suit. It was in a quiet grace that could disarm a child and heal a tense situation. He hadn't just lost an argument on a plane. He had been shown a completely different way to live, a way built on humility and compassion instead of arrogance and greed. And as he watched the quiet man pick up a simple, worn duffel bag from the carousel and walk away with a friendly wave to the family, the man in the suit was left with nothing but the hollow, echoing emptiness of his own life. The humiliation was no longer about being embarrassed. It was about the devastating, soul-crushing realization of just how small he truly was.